We're pleased today to have Doug Peterson with us. Mr. Peterson currently serves as the Attorney General for the state of Nebraska. Mr. Peterson, like you, graduated from UNL, future tense, past tense. He went on to study law at Pepperdine, took his law degree some years ago. Among other positions, he worked in the Lincoln County District Attorney's Office and as an assistant Nebraska Attorney General. Mr. Peterson was sworn in as Nebraska's 32nd Attorney General 2 years ago in January of 2015. Mr. Attorney General.
You know, you don't expect in February when you do a brisk walk from the Capitol over here that you're really going to sweat in February. But, well, thank you. Let me briefly kind of talk about what the office does, because a lot of people don't have a great sense of that. I'll talk about some of our initiatives. And then after that, I'd like to open it up to question and answer that can go outside the scopes of some of the things I'm talking about. But we're the Nebraska Department of Justice. We have 65 lawyers. We have 60 staff members. We really break up in 5 divisions. Our largest division is our criminal division. We send prosecutors all across the state for felonies. If it doesn't cause a problem, everyone's close enough. I might turn this off. Yikes. Okay. All right, I'll keep it on. So we send these prosecutors, you know, you look at Nebraska, you look at how we have such a large rural area. A lot of those county attorneys who serve out there, it's a part-time job. If you have a murder, if you have a child sexual assault, if you have a rape case out there, those lawyers are going to call our office and say, hey, can you send out your investigators? Can you send out your prosecutors to take this case? And so we send those teams all around the state. One of our priorities, because we get presented with a lot of different things, one of our priorities, with our limited manpower, what we're going to do is we're going to prioritize the most vulnerable, which primarily are children. We'll have murder cases that we do across the state. We won't do any misdemeanor cases, typically, unless there's a real unique conflict of interest in the county or something like that. We have to address misconduct by public officials, county public officials in our criminal bureau. We also handle all the criminal appeals. So if you have a defendant who appeals a conviction in Douglas County, Lancaster County, wherever in the 93 counties, our office is going to submit the brief to the Nebraska Court of Appeals or Supreme Court, and our office is going to do the oral argument. So that's our largest bureau and the one that's most active and the one that I try to spend a lot of my time with. Another bureau, our second largest, is our civil litigation. And our civil litigation people defend the state of Nebraska in all lawsuits brought against the state. So that can involve an employee at Game and Parks who gets injured and brings a workers' compensation claim, and there's some dispute. One of the assistant AGs will work that case in the workers' comp court, and that can include filing an original lawsuit in the U.S. Supreme Court against the state of Colorado on their marijuana laws. So it's a really, really broad spectrum of what they do. Also, our office in the civil litigation handles any lawsuits where what seems to be, in the 2 years I've been in office, what seems to be pretty common now is that there was, under the Obama administration, there were certain, remember the press conference where he said, I've got a pen and a phone. What took place there was a frustration that he couldn't get legislation passed, so basically he was doing things through executive order. And the states, when it impacted the states would collectively evaluate the case and determine whether or not it was outside the scope of their constitutional authority or the legislative language to try to do that. And if so, we would collectively bring a lawsuit and say they acted outside the scope. It's the exact same thing happened in the state of Washington with regards to the executive order on immigration. state of Washington. Now, we looked at that. We looked at the statutory regulatory authority that he was utilizing, and although we had questions about whether he implemented it well, the authority issue was there. But that's one of the really important roles our office plays, is to make sure that federal authorities don't interpret their authority at the cost of states, and that's all handled within the civil litigation area. We also have ag and natural resource, and that the lawyers who work in that area are specially trained in environmental law issues. So they'll work with the Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Natural Resources. The most active thing in that particular area is the litigation that we have among the neighboring states on water flow. And so those lawsuits, as far as dollar exposure, get pretty significant, and oftentimes they involve contracts that were entered into between the states back in 1918. It's a really specialized area of the law. It's our smallest bureau, but they handle some really important stuff. The other one we have is consumer protection. In our consumer protection division, ever since the big tobacco settlement in the 90s, attorney generals across the country have been more engaged in coming together and doing consumer protection cases. I'll give you a quick example. There were the 5 cell phone providers. Those 5 cell phone providers had somewhat colluded to develop a practice of charging $9.99 a month to provide you services on your cell phones that no one requested and no one really used. Horoscopes, recipes, a lot of stuff that was not in the consumer's best interest. Well, no consumer is going to go to a lawyer and say, hey, I've got a $9.99 bill for the last year and a half. Would you bring it against AT&T or Verizon? But when consumer protection states come together, do a preliminary investigation as to practices, and after we conclude that we believe it's an unfair consumer fraud practice, when 34 states ask 5 companies to sit down and tell them, we're on to what you're doing and we're going to bring an action, what are you guys going to do about it? All of that derived, that kind of game plan all got started with the big tobacco lawsuit back in '94 that was started by Mississippi, and several states joined. So what they typically do is, if their hands are dirty, they will sit down, and we typically do a master settlement agreement or a master agreement. I don't know, did any of you guys get a check for $9.99 from your provider? The problem is we can't really fully reimburse the consumer, but what the most important thing we can do is stop the practice and then try to get a little bit of compensation for the people. That's an interesting department that's growing. Volkswagen is a big case of consumer fraud that has come up in the last 12 months. We also try to get out and educate people about consumer fraud activity, because the biggest frustration about consumer fraud is so much of this is done overseas, or the money's wired out of the country, so it's very, very difficult for us to be able to recover it. So plan B is, how can we get out to citizens across the state and try to educate them on how to be aware of protecting yourself from consumer fraud. The worst case that I've seen happened about a year ago, and I came walking in the office and I recognized this couple in our conference room. And so I went and sat down and talked to them. I recognized them from actually when I campaigned for office. And they were from central Nebraska. He had retired a year ago. She was going to work one more year and then retire. Well, during the year of his retirement, he was starting to send in cards where win the lottery type thing. Well, lo and behold, they get a phone call, and they're told that they won $450,000 in the lottery. In order to receive and claim the money, though, you have to send $2,500 for a tax stamp. The husband was all fired up. The wife was kind of skeptical. The husband sends in a check for $2,500. 9 months later, they're in our office. They still have no check. At the beginning of the conversation, she told me the people from the lottery company are coming to meet with us on Thursday. Do you think it's possible someone from your office can come with us? Because we've tried to set up 3 prior meetings and they didn't show up. As I'm hearing this story, it's a classic scam. I bring over our bureau chief, Abby Stemson, from the Consumer Protection Division, Abby sits down with this couple. In that 9-month period, guess how many checks they wrote to this company? 23 checks for $245,000. This couple, they don't have $245,000. I mean, the fact that they dug into their retirement to do this, it's just amazing. Now, here's the kicker of the whole story. After spending an hour and a half with them and telling them on numerous times that these people didn't exist, because they referred to names to people they'd spoken with and things like that, at the end of the meeting, the wife looks at Abby and says, "So will you have anyone at our meeting on Thursday?" And it kind of just takes your heart out, because you recognize they still don't get it. They're still holding out hope. It's a little bit like a slot machine. It's going to hit. I just have to keep plugging it. It's going to hit. And it almost, they kept chasing money. They kept chasing what they put in. So those we, unfortunately, are not in a position to really help. But that's consumer protection. And then the final one is legal services, where we provide opinions to senators or other state officials, questions about open meetings laws, public records, and things of that nature. And they provide a real important service of really studying the law. Let me just quickly tell you some of the initiatives that we've tried to do. You know, if you look at separation of power, we're the executive branch. We're not the legislative branch. When I first got into office, I have to kind of chuckle, because I had no experience with the Nebraska legislature. I'd been in private litigation for 25 years, and then 2 years as a prosecutor, 3 years in the Attorney General's office. But I was told, hey, and there was one legislative thing I knew I wanted to do, but I didn't know if I was, the Attorney General can't introduce a bill. Only state senators can introduce a bill. But one of the things that prompted me to want to run for Attorney General was the area of human trafficking. My wife and I had supported a ministry called Tiny Hands in India in human trafficking. So we understood the problem that existed there. But lo and behold, I see an article where Senator McGill was going to be having committee hearings on human trafficking. I said, human trafficking in Nebraska? It just can't, that baffled me. So I went to the hearings, and then I participated in community meetings, and it was really a diverse group of people getting together, because everyone was troubled by the concept of sex and labor trafficking. What became real apparent to me was the best of intentions by volunteers was not going to move the ball. And what also baffled me is that Senator McGill, I thought to myself, and I asked someone involved in the process, I said, why are not 49 senators all unanimously behind this? And he said to me, Doug, you'd be surprised of the practices that some people are comfortable with. So what was clear to me in these meetings, and it went on for about 1.5 years, was that if you didn't have leadership coming either from the governor or out of the Attorney General's office, it was going to be hard to advance the ball on that. So that was one piece of legislation that when I got into office in January 2015, the team had already put together some legislation to strengthen our human trafficking laws, because prior to that point in time, the only way there would be any legitimate enforcement of human trafficking in Nebraska would have been through the federal prosecutors. Well, the federal prosecutors are typically looking for more at large-scale operations and ones that run across state lines. So if you have a sex trafficking operation in Grand Island, and it's a small operation, meaning one trafficker and 2 or 3 victims being trafficked, the feds have limited resources, and they're probably going to go after a bigger ring that runs between Chicago, Minneapolis, and Denver. So we didn't have a law in Nebraska. You'd be looking at potentially a pandering charge and a $500 fine if you were a trafficker. And traffickers stand to make a lot of money. You know, from an organized crime standpoint, the number one organized crime activity is drugs. And number 2 used to always be guns. Trafficking is now number 2. And there's 2 reasons organized crime is attracted to trafficking. One If you're looking at drugs or guns, you have to go out and buy your supply, mark it up, and sell it. The other thing is you've got federal authorities who are all over it looking for violations, particularly in drugs. You run a human trafficking operation, you turn these young girls and young boys into commodities. And all you have to do is feed them, sleep, or provide housing, feed them, and there are two different methods that traffickers use. One method is to be, hey, I love you, I'm going to take care of you, and someday we'll get out of this and we'll have enough money to buy a nice house. So they do the coercion, deception. The other more common one is force and intimidation. And typically they look for vulnerable young girls. The entry age of sex trafficking used to be around 15, now it's down around 13. And they look for vulnerable girls. And I'll give you an example. Big case in Nebraska. There was a man and a woman in Bellevue, or not Bellevue, South Omaha. And she'd actually worked for a much larger trafficking operation out of Council Bluffs. And then she said to her husband, we can do this and make a lot more money ourselves. She takes her nephew, who I think went to Millard North, handsome young kid, graduates from high school, and they said, look, we want to use you as a recruiter. So she sent her nephew to go to sporting events and malls to look for disattached young girls. And so he went up to a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old at a football game, and they fit the description. They weren't in with a whole group of kids. They're kind of wandering around the concession stand. So he goes down there and he says, hey, are you girls interested in partying? And they talked for a few minutes, but the girls basically told him they weren't. Now this girl was actually within the juvenile court system, was in a little trouble herself. She actually had a band from the juvenile court around her ankle. 2 weeks later, she's home, she gets into a big argument with her parents, and he had given them his cell phone number. He said, if you ever want to party, just call me. 2 weeks later, the girl gets into a big fight with her parents. She calls her 13-year-old friend and says, I'm running away, do you want to join me? And she said, well, where are you going to go? She said, well, we'll call that guy who gave us the number. So she calls, sure enough, he drives up, picks him up, takes him to this house in South Omaha, and they drink, they eat pizza, and around 2 o'clock, the call comes in, and the 15-year-old, not the 13-year-old, but the 15-year-old has said, come on, you're going with me. And they start heading over towards the boats in Council Bluffs. Now this practice is a little bit unusual because typically in trafficking, what you need to do with a 15-year-old girl is, or 14, 13, whatever, you need to train them up a little bit. And that's typically done through pornography. Because pornography has two effects. It lowers the individual expectation of their body being their body and their own private, what's the word I'm looking for, their own private dignity, if you will. It lowers their protections of their own self. It also displays the behaviors that customers would want to see as far as clothing and other things. So it's used as training. But this young girl was taken that very night over to the boats, and that's a very classic deal. 2 o'clock in the morning, whether through the internet or some other source, they will develop their connection. And so she's being taken over to Council Bluffs, and she, in fact, was placed in that position. And when she came back, they'd been there about 2 days, and she said, we're getting out of here. And she knew that her 13-year-old friend was about ready to be placed in the business model. The other thing they did is the next night, they brought in a 19-year-old who they'd been trafficking, who had a child. And they beat up the 19-year-old in front of the two girls to show this is how we operate. And the 15-year-old said, we're getting out of here. They got out of the house. They found a car that was warming up. It was at night. They found a car that was warming up. It was snow. Can't remember what the temperature was, but it was very cold, and this girl was barefooted. And they took off. They thought they were heading to Des Moines. She didn't know where. She's 15 years old, barely drive. Didn't take long. She lost control. I think she lost control of the car out on I-80. Can't remember the exact location. But anyway, this was what you would call a fairly small trafficking organization, the number of girls. But this was the kind of one that Nebraska, they prosecuted that case federally because they could set up the Iowa connection, the interstate connection that would be necessary. So they were successful in that prosecution. But other cases that could occur, say just exclusively in Grand Island, we didn't have a good law to get that addressed. So back in 2015, the Nebraska legislature passed a good human trafficking law. The problem is our penalties are not quite stiff enough still. We thought initially passing that law that if we put in pretty strong penalties like 25 to 50 years, that we would get too much pushback. Well, human trafficking has come more to the forefront of people's awareness. And now, 2 years later, we think we will be successful. When that bill it got passed 49-0 2 years ago, strengthening our human trafficking laws, and now there's going to be a hearing on Thursday to try to up the penalties, and Senator Pansy Brooks has been leading that. We drafted up the language, and then she's basically introducing that. So that's one that we've been involved in. We've been trying to do a ton in 2016 of education. Education really matters. Law enforcement need to know what to look for. I was talking to some troopers out in western Nebraska, and they said, you know, it used to be if we pulled someone over and they were coming from out of state and figured out they're heading to Minnesota, we'd typically look for a drug interdiction. He said, now if we see a 16-year-old girl sitting in the back seat, he said our whole perspective is a little bit different. We want to know about who's that 15-year-old, 16-year-old girl. We need to know, is there some trafficking that takes place? A good example was in the medical field. About 80% of girls and boys who are trafficked at one time or another have some type of medical need. And so it's really important that they have interaction with that the medical people be aware for signs. We had an emergency room doctor close by here to Lincoln, had a young girl come in, about 16 years old. She was pregnant, but she was barely showing, but she was having complications with her pregnancy, and whether she might be a delivery, I'm not sure of that. But that doctor a week earlier had been at a training program and had been told, here are the signs to look for in your emergency room of someone who's being trafficked. Well, one, the young man that came with her was in the emergency room saying to the staff, how long is this going to take? That's not a classic attitude of a father. Other signs that he said, other things he said were not consistent. The young girl was very quiet, but when they had her in the examination room, right underneath her panty line was a barcode. And the doctor knew, okay, enough information here. I see a barcode, because tattooing is very common in this industry to basically establish your circle of girls and boys that you're trafficking. So she saw the barcode, she saw the behavior of the young man, she called the police. Sure enough, he was arrested, and we were able to get a conviction of a trafficking ring there. So that's one of the things that falls within, the shortest definition of the Attorney General is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the state of Nebraska. And so this is an area where we're getting more awareness, we're getting more information. One of our challenges is to continue to develop care providers who understand the complexity of human trafficking. Because if you have a 15-year-old girl who ran away from a home where she was sexually abused, physically abused, never wants to go back to that home again. And now she's in a trafficking situation where she's not, let's say, it's one of those traffickers who says, I'll take care of you, I love you, and making the promises. And you come in and you bust up a trafficking ring. Law enforcement has a big challenge of getting her to understand you can trust us. You should not be used, to get her to separate herself from what's going on. And that's a challenge. And a lot of times that takes a significant amount of time of working with the young girl and basically restoring her dignity to the point where she'll finally say, okay, let me tell you, he ran us up to Sioux City, he ran us to Norfolk, and all of it's done almost exclusively, I shouldn't say exclusively, a large portion of it is done through the internet. Other portions are done, certain regions you'll see, or certain cultures will run things through massage parlors, certain bars, and also nail salons are all kind of national patterns. So that was an important initiative for us, and 2017, I think we're going to start seeing more convictions now that I think we've done the training work. Another initiative that we did is the prescription drug monitoring program. And that was another priority to me. Once we got my first year, we actually did a so-called legislative package, but it just didn't feel right to me as an executive branch being the one to try to roll out this new legislation. So my second year, we wanted to work closely with senators and say, hey, we'll help you with drafting the language, but we want this to be led out by a senator who believes in the cause. And so Senator Howard had already been engaged in prescription drugs. She had lost a sister to prescription drug overdose. We had a very close friend of ours have his son go through. He had an injury down here in Nebraska, and when they operated on his shoulder, he got addicted to OxyContin. And it was 3 years of absolute hell walking this family through this. He was stealing from everybody. And his dad was doing everything he could to keep the kid from falling, which made things worse. But one of the big problems in Nebraska was Nebraska and Missouri were probably the two, well, not probably, they were the two states in the country that basically did not have sufficient monitoring abilities of pharmacy shopping and doctor shopping for opiate-based drugs. And so we worked in legislation there. That was a priority. The legislation went into effect was passed last year, went into effect January of this year. And it's just come out. So we've upped the game in prescription drug abuse. But it's just started in January, and there's a lot of bugs that need to be worked out. At the same time, in my meetings with attorney generals from particularly the eastern states, but also Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, they've got a full-fledged fentanyl and heroin and prescription drug crisis. We're not there yet. And one of the questions was, what can we do now in Nebraska to try to prevent the epidemic in our state? And what AGs were telling me is kind of a three-pronged approach: prevention programs, law enforcement, changing the perspective from now we're not going after possession's not the target, dealership and dealership chains are the target. So the idea is if you come into a Walmart and there's someone who's OD'd in the parking lot, the Ohio AG said, Doug, you know where we find most of our ODs is in Walmart and McDonald's. Because they're so desperate, the transaction occurs there, they take the drug there, the drug gets laced with fentanyl, they overdose, and if we can get to them quickly enough, there's a drug called Narcan that the officers basically spray into the nose, and it's an amazing drug. It's called the Lazarus drug. It's been around for a while, but it actually brings them back to life. Did any of you guys see that video? You can't be OD'd for 3 days when we come by, but if you get them soon enough, you can get off the receptors and revive them. I was going to ask, 2 videos that came out that were pretty powerful. One was in Ohio, a grandmother, her boyfriend in a van, and a 4-year-old boy sitting in a car seat. Okay. Those were opioid-based overdoses. They may have been fentanyl. Both of those, the grandmother and her boyfriend, would have been dead if you just left them there. But they were able to get Narcan into them and revive them. But when you look at the eyes of that 4-year-old boy, your grandson sitting in that car seat, it's pretty powerful. The other one that came out at about the same time was, I think, a Dollar General store. And it was a 20-year-old mother. And she'd OD'd right there in one of the aisles. And she had a 2-year-old daughter, long hair. She had her Frozen onesie on. And she's sitting there trying to lift her mom's head, brush her mom's hair away from her face, and trying to, did anyone see that? If you went on YouTube and said, Mom OD's 2-year-old daughter tries to help, What happened there is they called 911, and then some guy just sat there and videotaped it with his phone. They were able to get to that mother and get her revived. So from a law enforcement, we were taking a three-pronged approach to this: prevention, and the biggest area that I think we're making inroads on is we brought together the medical community, and we're saying, look, docs, we have to completely change our pain management plan. And that was happening nationally. Nationally, they were saying, hey, we have to completely change how we address pain. It was, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but just to give you an idea how this happened. In the 80s, 90s, what was happening, there used to be the 4 vital signs. They take your blood pressure, your weight, your heart rate, and I can't remember the fourth one, temperature. What was happening is a lot of people were complaining that their pain was not being properly managed, and the doctors were claiming, well, we don't have great drugs. The federal government said, we're going to make pain the 5th vital sign. And so you now, as physicians, have to manage pain. And it will be part of the surveys of which patients will evaluate your quality of care as a physician. At the same time, large pharmaceutical companies came in and said, guess what? We have developed better opiate-based drugs. We have a study from the 1980s that less than 5% of people become addicted to this. Now, if most people would know, I wouldn't know because I flunked chemistry in high school, but most people would know that opioid is basically it's the base of heroin, okay? So here you've got pharmacies coming in and saying we got the same base of heroin, but only 5%, less than 5% of people will run a risk of getting addicted to this. So the doctors are given a message, you're not managing pain well enough, and we will monitor you with this. Big Pharma says we've got a drug here that'll do the trick. And it was. I mean, there are some serious pain management cases that can best be managed by an opiate-based drug. But what happened was, it was just, the amount that was being prescribed, the failure to monitor your patient quickly after it occurs. I had knee surgery, and I think I had initially prescribed to me like 60 pills of hydrocodone. Well, I was really guarded, and frankly, it helped with pain for 2 or 3 days, and then I stopped taking it, and I didn't have any sensation from it. But my wife had double knee replacement, and she said, I really don't like this because it really made her feel odd, and so we got rid of it real quickly. Well, doctors weren't monitoring that at all. They were just prescribing it. You know where some of our worst problems are? It's not young people stealing prescription drugs, that's a problem. One of our biggest problems is elderly people across rural places in Nebraska who deal with chronic pain, and a family doctor who continues to prescribe this to them, and they've become addicted to it. So now your 70-year-old grandmother has an oxy habit, and then lo and behold, your 65-year-old grandfather figures out that there's some value in this, and he uses some of them, but he sells them too to some of the guys down at the bar. So it's just, it goes through all economic classes, all demographics, geographic areas in Nebraska where you're finding people who are dying. And our big problem is when your 20-year-old kid dies of an Oxycontin overdose in a small town, Nebraska, that's not really reported. When a 22-year-old mom is taking fentanyl patches and squeezing the juice out into her Mountain Dew with her 2-year-old daughter in the basement, and she overdoses and dies in her parents' basement. They weren't even gonna, the original officers were not even gonna address that as a drug overdose, and then the DEA officials came and said, I wanna see that Mountain Dew can. And inside the Mountain Dew can, they found the fentanyl patches, where she'd squeezed them, put them in the Mountain Dew and drank them. This is so underreported. When coroner calls are done, it used to be we'd get some detailed data as to how much opioid might have been in their system. We stopped doing that. Hopefully we'll get back to doing that so we can monitor it. So all that to say is that the prescription drug monitoring legislation was an initiative, but the problem's so much more significant than that. And as a chief law enforcement officer, we can uniquely try to be engaged in bringing the medical community together, the law enforcement community together, and the treatment community together. so that we don't develop a crisis. So that's an initiative that we're really involved in. The other one that we're very engaged in is child sexual assault, child abuse. One of the problems in Nebraska is at our law enforcement training academy, they can only take so many students. If you get hired in Gordon, Nebraska to be a deputy sheriff, you need, are you from Gordon? It's just purely for example purposes. I just randomly checked, used Gordon. But the reality is a lot of small towns, when they hire a deputy, there's a real shortage in law enforcement. Those people need to be trained, but they may not have much background at all. And you can't get them into the law enforcement training academy for 10 months. And then all of a sudden you have a 10-year-old who shows up in the school and says, Mom's boyfriend is doing things that are wrong to my little sister. And the only guy available at the time is this guy who's been a deputy sheriff for 2 months. So the school calls. Now we get one shot. When that 10-year-old gets the courage, because he knows that guy's going to beat the crap out of him, when he gets the courage to come to a teacher, and the teacher does the right thing, comes to administration comes to law enforcement, we only get one shot at that kid. If we don't get it right the first time, it is very, very difficult to get it right the second time in that case. And so what we did is, along with the League of Municipalities, and frankly, the League of Municipalities were the ones who came to us and suggested it, but we put up 8 regional training programs in the state so that every law enforcement officer would be within an hour's drive. And if they knew they weren't going to be able to get to the academy, but what we found out was a lot of officers who had been officers for some time said, we're coming because we want the training. So we spent a whole day just telling them how to properly investigate child abuse cases, child sexual assault. And that unit is so important, and our investigators are so important. We had a case where a girl was raped, and I don't know if it was by her dad or some man. The investigating agency did not take photos of the house. They did very little in the investigation. And what ended up happening is the prosecutor realized how weak his case was. And they heard one of our lawyers speak at a seminar. And so they brought the case to us, which would have been about 9 or 10 months since the charge had been brought. And we were, there's a speedy trial issue, but when the charge or the allegations were brought and the lack of investigation. And I was so impressed with what the investigator was able to do in our office. He went out to this small community. They didn't live in this house anymore. I think it was a rental house. And the girl had said it was pink carpet, and she identified a certain spot in the room. And the officer, or the investigator, contacted the landlord and said, would you mind if I came in and investigated the room? And the landlord was fine with coming. And so he took from the girl's statement, and he went to the area of the room, and he took samples. And from the samples, we were able to get DNA off that was consistent with the suspect. And so now, all of a sudden, I can't remember the girl's age, but it was 12, 13, something like that, giving that detail, and then the investigator being able to cut up a carpet sample with DNA, sperm conformations in that area, that all of a sudden becomes a much more doable prosecution under the burdens of proof that are in criminal trials. So that's what we're trying to do this second year now. What we're going to do is kind of do an advanced child sexual assault, child abuse case. And what we're also trying to do is get the word out, particularly in areas where they don't have experienced investigators or prosecutors. Please don't be territorial, which is a given, but also please don't hesitate, because the quicker we can gather evidence, the better. And so typically now we're able to work in cooperation with them, and I shouldn't say now, but we're stressing it even more to work in cooperation in investigations. And then finally, an area that the those are three areas that I kind of identified before I came into office. One area that I didn't, and that was in the area of, I heard the line, and I'll admit I used the line, federal pushback. But one of the things that was pretty active in the last 2 years, and it waits to be seen what's going to happen in the next 2 years of my term, but is just this federal overreach issue, where under different federal laws, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and it's no secret, and it happens by Republicans, it happens by Democrats, it happens by special interest group, but what they will do is, as agencies, they will take the law and try to stretch, either by expanding in regulation or interpretive letters, to try to expand beyond the scope of what the law was intended. Our whole position to that is, look, if you're trying to expand the nature of the law, for example, waters of the U.S., if you're trying to expand the definition of jurisdiction by federal authorities controlling water issues in Nebraska, you need to do that legislatively. You can't do that through a bureaucratic attempt to expand or circumvent, because what it comes down to is one word: power. If they're able to expand regulations, it expands power, and so all of a sudden a rancher's told, guess what, we've got jurisdiction over that dry stream bed, because we know in spring you'll get water that runs through there, and now it's a navigable waters, and it's now under our control. And so that's what that battle was all about. If you think about it, all of us would want that, because my experience is, if you can address something at a local level in your city or county, your voice is far better heard. At a state level, it's far better heard through your senators. Once you get to Washington, D.C., and the type of money that floats around there, it's so much harder to be heard. And under the Constitution, my argument would be, unless the Constitution enumerates the powers and rights to the federal government, they stay with the state. That's what the 10th Amendment's about. But it makes sense that the founders realized that the best way for the governed to have input on those who govern them is to keep it at a local basis. So a lot of people go, well, your fight's political, you're a Republican. Obama couldn't have done anything right, you were just looking for ways. And I said, no, actually, I took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. And when I see whether it's Trump or Obama, whoever is in that authority position, when they go outside the scope of their statutory authority or their constitutional authority, the states have a responsibility to call them on it. So those are the four issues that have probably been the most in the 2 years I've been in office. One of the great blessings for me in that office is, when I got in the office, the attorneys and the staff were just excellent public servants. And so it made I was very impressed in the people I met and dealt with in our office and all these issues. And so they've been a great bunch to work with. When I talk to other attorney generals, it seems some of the offices get very, very political, and then that gets ugly. And we didn't have that in Nebraska. It was a pretty smooth transition. So I've got about 13 minutes left if anyone has any questions.
I think we're on. Yep.
So, when you're talking about keeping the government small and stuff, how do you go and hold accountability for the big Washington and presidents accountable for stepping?
Lawsuits. I mean, it's difficult if a federal agency has determined that they're going to expand their authorities. Let me give you a good example, because you're not going to get this in the newspaper. Title IX was a law created in the 70s. It was intended to bring equity between male and female students. So that's why in the 70s you saw so many sports and things being offered on high school and college level for women's sports, because of the inequity that existed. It was very clear when Title VII was created, it was male, female, okay? Did I say Title VII? I meant Title IX. The case interpretations of Title IX and Title VII passed by Congress oftentimes have some comparabilities that are used in analysis. What happened in May, the Department of Education, and they have actually been doing an interpretation that under Title IX, the word sex would include transgender and sexual orientation. Well, that battle had been fought either under Title VII or Title IX in the courts, and there had not been a Supreme Court decision that said, yes, sex means transgender. And in fact, the legislative history made it really clear that it was male-female. Then there were some attempts to change the legislation, and those failed. To show you the way a bureaucratic agency can work to expand the power and what we would have to do in response to it is then the Department of Education and the Department of Justice issued a letter, and they called it a guidance letter. And the guidance letter said, look, if you want to continue to receive Title IX funding, okay, so there's the hammer. Title IX funding from the federal government to our schools is significant. And they said, if you want to continue to receive funding, you shall interpret, I don't think they said you shall, but the interpretation of sex should include transgender, okay? All right, two things there that I think from a public policy perspective people would want to think about. Number one, an agency just interpreted a law in the way the courts and the Congress had not been willing to do. And you may say, for my worldview or from my perspective, that's a good definition. I'm comfortable with it. Go with it. And don't object to it. What happens when 4 years later, 2 years later, the bureaucrat in that position of power with really no accountability takes a position or a definition that is completely contrary to the way you believe? Is the standard the same? Are you okay with it now? Because you got to choose. Either we hold the branches of government to comply with the separations of power and the proper procedure, or we don't. We can't have it halfway this way with the ones we like. Here's the other thing that gets back to maybe this comment I made about local control and ability to have input. I talked to school administrators when this came out, and I said, how do you address an issue when a student comes forward and says, I've been diagnosed as transgender, or the DSM-5, which is a diagnostic manual used in the healthcare community, labels it as gender dysphoria. And they said, what we do is, if the student comes forward, we will work with the parents and the student and the healthcare provider. Now, why is that important? In order to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, when I was in private practice for 25 years, when any type of diagnosis was being given, the DSM, Diagnostic Statistic Manual, basically it's the Bible utilized. It's in its 5th version. You couldn't diagnose anyone with a psychological condition unless you could go to the DSM-5 and say, here are the criteria, and this person has had these symptoms, paranoid schizophrenia, all the different psychological conditions. Gender dysphoria, particularly with juveniles, is a highly complicated issue. With juveniles, sexuality is a highly complex issue. And so what the local school districts would do is they would sit down, just like any types of requests that come up, and they would kind of develop an individualized plan, trying to respect both the safety or the emotional needs of that child with the input of medical community parents, and also recognizing how it would work within the responsibilities of the other student body. I call that a responsible approach. What the federal government did is they said, you want our money, and it's a lot of money, and they want, there's no question, they want the money. Do you want our money? Here's what you got to do. Gender dysphoria can be determined by the child themselves. You don't need a medical diagnosis, okay? And you actually don't need the parents to be engaged in the process. And what you'll have to do as a school district, if requested, is you will have to open up facilities to this particular child based upon their self-identification. And school districts going, whoa, whoa, whoa. That gives a lot of power and authority to one individual student and really makes the more personalized evaluation of it completely non-existent. I mean, it was structured clearly that the child could make that identification. Johns Hopkins University was one of the leading universities in doing sex transfer surgeries, changes. What they were finding out is after they were doing the surgeries that a lot of the psychological concerns that the patient had before had really not changed and become worse. So they went back 40 years. This just came out. You can go find it in the New Atlantic, Johns Hopkins study on transgender. It's not study on trans, it's study on sexuality, I think is the title. So Johns Hopkins was in the front edge of transgender issues as far as medical surgery that was utilized. They saw troubling results afterwards. So they went back and they did meta-analysis where they went down and they tried to find across the globe all studies done on sexuality. And the question was, born this way, treatment, and I'm just going to throw this out because I think this is really interesting in the world that you guys live in right now. Their conclusion after looking at every study they could find in the area after 40 years is that gender dysphoria, particularly among juveniles, and one of the authors said his biggest concern was people were taking 6-year-old kids and putting them in hormone therapy based upon their conclusion of gender dysphoria when they didn't even come close to meeting any of the criteria. And the complexity of how many young kids grow out of this condition over a period of time. And that this pressure is being created, hey, if you want to be seen progressive and being caring and everything else, the boy who wants to play with dolls at age 4 is gender dysphoria. And you go, you know what? It's actually far more complex than that. And you don't make that evaluation in a period of a 6-month or 2 years. It has to be evaluated over a period of time before you would ever do anything like gene therapy. But what they said in the introduction I thought was really interesting for you as university students is it said, we appreciate all the input we received from academics, medical community, in the acknowledgments. But unfortunately, numerous academics, I'm using the word academics, professors who had helped in this study or given analysis, asked that they not be listed, their names not be identified in acknowledgments. They said one is that there was concern of backlash by the LGBT community. 2, there was concern there'd be backlash by the religious right community. And you can see when you watch this report, they're doing everything they can to stay to the science. They're doing everything they can to be away from politics and just stay to the science. And they emphasize it several times. But here's the third thing that they were concerned about. They were concerned about detrimental consequences in the academic communities in which they taught. That if they didn't buy in to the transgender arguments, if they didn't buy in and for some reason stood back and said, hey, I think we do need to look at the studies, that they would suffer persecution within their university. And the author said, he goes, I think that's a sad comment on a sad state of affairs for our academic community, that people will not follow the science, that they will not seek to go to the science because there's so much political pressure there. So there is an example where I would say administrative agency attempts to take a law beyond the scope because of their frustration that they can't get the legislation passed, has big impact on Nebraska schools and has an impact on the state too. So we bring an action saying that's beyond the scope. What you're trying to do is intimidate schools and withdraw funding if they didn't accept your interpretation. It's not politically correct in a lot of ways, Because it's easy to label me, because we brought the lawsuit, well, I'm a hater. And I understand it's a complicated issue, and I look at this situation of a young kid and the difficulty the family or the child may be dealing with, and I tell you what, I'm far more comfortable with how Lincoln Public Schools deals with that than what this letter would suggest. So that's one example.
Thank you.
I kind of filibustered on that.
Any more?
I'm not limiting just the topics. I mean, if you want, there's a lot of issues in front of the state and in our country that.
This isn't a super important question, but have you ever been to Gordon, Nebraska?
Have I ever been to Gordon? Yes, I have.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to know.
I've been to Gordon. I went through Gordon because of the White Clay situation. And I can't go into a great deal of detail. But boy, there's a good example. There's a good case study of federal government policy and overall effectiveness. It's a very depressing deal. And we're going to do everything we can in our laws to deal with it. But I got to tell you, don't hold out hope that we will provide a long-term solution, because it is very complex and it's very disheartening. When I went up there, I tried to go up there and just get a real sense of just driving around and trying to get a feel for it. And I went up there with kind of some optimism of creating enterprise zones and things like that. And I went up with much more optimism and came back with much more discouragement. And we've done an extended effort, and we'll be carrying out those extended efforts, but it's not going to answer the problem.
I think our time might be far spent. I might mention to you, Mr. Attorney General, that a number of perhaps these students here, but others, work with Tessa Peters in your Consumer Protection Division. We send a lot of interns to that
Meditators?
office.
Mediators. Is there some mediators here?
I don't know. I don't recognize anyone offhand, but we do have a group each semester that work there usually about a year. Tessa likes to keep them on.
Uh-huh.
And so we try to keep you stocked.
Yeah,
with
well, I
good
appreciate
students.
that. Every now and then I pop in there and they kind of look at me and I kind of look at them. Like, oh. There's normally about 8 mediators, and what they'll handle is consumer disputes and see if they can find resolution dealing with the companies and the disgruntled consumer.
Well, maybe we'll recruit some out of this group to do that work.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.